"Mayday, mayday, we have an emergency. We're going down, we're going down." The desperate voice of Captain James Thane crackled through the static-filled radio as British European Airways Flight 609 struggled against the unforgiving elements at Munich Airport on that fateful February 6, 1958. The snow was falling heavily across the German tarmac, creating a white blanket that would soon become a frozen tomb for dreams, hopes, and brilliant young lives that were about to be cut tragically short. Inside the Airspeed Ambassador aircraft, 18 members of the Manchester United football team sat alongside journalists, team officials, and passengers, completely unaware that they were living their final moments. The excitement from their recent match against Red Star Belgrade still filled the cabin, young voices discussing tactics and celebrating their advancement in the European Cup, their laughter echoing through the aircraft as teacher and journalist Frank Swift raised his camera to capture what he thought would be a memorable moment of triumph. Little did anyone know that this photograph would become one of the most haunting images in aviation history, frozen in time just seconds before an explosion that would shake the football world to its core and leave an entire generation mourning the loss of the Busby babes. The story begins hours earlier in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, where Manchester United had just secured a remarkable 3-3 draw against Red Star Belgrade, a result that propelled them into the semi-finals of the European Cup. The team, affectionately known as the Busby Babes, after their visionary manager Matt Busby, represented the future of English football. These weren't just athletes, they were young men with families, dreams, and entire lifetimes ahead of them. Duncan Edwards, just 21 years old, was already being hailed as one of the greatest midfielders England had ever produced. His powerful frame belied a gentle nature, and teammates often spoke of his infectious laugh and his habit of writing letters to his mother after every match. Tommy Taylor, the prolific striker, had been laughing with his teammates about plans for the weekend, talking excitedly about taking his girlfriend to see the new film at the cinema. Roger Byrne, the captain, was discussing future matches with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he had decades of football ahead of him, his notebook filled with tactical observations and ideas for improving the team's European campaign. The chartered British European Airways flight was supposed to be a routine journey home, a celebration of their European success, but the weather had other plans. Captain James Thane, an experienced pilot with thousands of hours in his logbook, had served with distinction during World War II and had flown countless commercial flights without incident. His reputation for safety and professionalism was impeccable, and passengers often felt reassured when they learned he was their pilot. Today, however, he faced conditions that would test every skill he had acquired during his years in aviation. He had already attempted 2 takeoffs from Munich's Riem airport during their refueling stop, each attempt growing more dangerous as the weather deteriorated. The Airspeed Ambassador, registration GALZU, was a reliable aircraft with a strong safety record, but the slush and snow on the runway created dangerous conditions that made takeoff extremely challenging. The aircraft itself was relatively new to the fleet, having been delivered just a few years earlier, and its twin engines were known for their reliability in normal conditions. The first attempt had been aborted when the engines failed to reach sufficient power due to the icy conditions affecting the air intake. Captain Thane had felt the aircraft struggling against the elements, the usual smooth acceleration replaced by an unsettling hesitation that every experienced pilot recognizes as a warning sign. The second attempt ended similarly when the aircraft failed to achieve the necessary speed for liftoff, the wheels struggling to find purchase on the increasingly treacherous surface. Passengers were growing anxious, some beginning to question whether they should continue the journey. But there was still an atmosphere of camaraderie and excitement among the Manchester United party. Frank Swift, the former England goalkeeper who was now working as a journalist covering the team for the News of the World, moved through the cabin with his camera, documenting what everyone expected to be just another delay in their journey home to Manchester. Swift was more than just a journalist to these players. He was a beloved figure who had bridged the gap between his playing career and his new role in the press. During his time as England's goalkeeper, he had been known for his larger-than-life personality and his ability to keep teammates relaxed before important matches. Now, at 44 years old, he brought that same calming presence to his work as a reporter. The players trusted him completely, knowing that he understood the pressures they faced and would always write about them with fairness and respect. His photographs from the European campaign had already become treasured mementos, capturing not just the football but the personalities and friendships that made this Manchester United team so special. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, and ice was beginning to form on the aircraft's wings and control surfaces in a way that made the ground crew increasingly nervous. Airport officials were working frantically to clear the runway, their heavy machinery struggling against the relentless snowfall that seemed to replace every flake they removed. The weather forecast had predicted improving conditions, but instead the storm was intensifying with each passing hour. Captain Thane consulted with his co-pilot, Captain Kenneth Raymond, about the possibility of postponing the flight until the morning, weighing the safety concerns against the various pressures they faced. Raymond, younger but equally experienced, shared Thane's growing unease about the conditions, but both men were acutely aware of the expectations placed upon them. The pressure to get the team home was immense and came from multiple sources. Manchester United had a crucial league match coming up, and every hour of delay meant less preparation time for a team already pushed to their limits by the demands of competing in both domestic and European competitions. The Football League had initially opposed United's participation in the European Cup, arguing that it would interfere with domestic obligations, and any delays would only fuel further criticism. Additionally, the charter flight was expensive, and extending the stay in Munich would incur additional costs that the club was eager to avoid. The passengers themselves, after the excitement of their victory in Belgrade, were anxious to return home to their families and normal routines. Matt Busby, the team's manager, was particularly eager to return. At 48 years old, he had built Manchester United into one of the most exciting teams in Europe through his revolutionary approach of developing young talent rather than buying established stars. The Busby Babes were his creation, young players he had nurtured from teenagers into international stars. The European Cup represented the ultimate validation of his methods, and the semi-final they had just reached was the furthest any English team had progressed in the competition. Busby was already planning for the semi-final matches and the potential final, his mind racing with tactical preparations and team selections. The delay in Munich was an unwelcome distraction from these important considerations. The decision was made to attempt one final takeoff, despite the increasingly treacherous conditions. The airport authorities assured Captain Thane that the runway had been cleared as much as possible, though they acknowledged that the weather was making their efforts largely futile. The aircraft was refueled and de-iced, though the effectiveness of the de-icing was questionable given the continued snowfall and freezing temperatures. As the passengers settled back into their seats for the third time, there was a noticeable change in atmosphere. The initial excitement had given way to nervous tension, with some passengers expressing concern about the wisdom of attempting another takeoff in such conditions. Frank Swift positioned himself to take what he hoped would be a triumphant photograph of the team's departure from Munich. His camera, a professional-grade model that he had invested in specifically for covering Manchester United's European campaign, was loaded with black and white film that would capture the historic moment in sharp detail. Swift had already taken dozens of photographs during the trip, documenting everything from the team's arrival in Belgrade to their preparation for the match against Red Star. His editor back in London was expecting a comprehensive photo essay that would capture not just the football but the human story of these young Englishmen conquering Europe. The other passengers included several other journalists who had covered the match, each bringing their own perspective and expertise to the story. Henry Rose of the Daily Express was known for his insightful match reports and his ability to capture the tactical nuances that casual fans might miss. George Follows of the Daily Herald had developed close relationships with several of the players and was working on a series of profile pieces that would explore their backgrounds and personalities. Frank Taylor of the News Chronicle was considered one of the most respected football writers of his generation, and his presence on the trip lent additional credibility to the coverage of Manchester United's European adventure. At exactly 3:04 p.m. local time, Flight 609 began its third and final takeoff attempt. The Airspeed Ambassador's engines roared to life with a sound that seemed more labored than usual, the cold air and icy conditions affecting their performance in subtle but critical ways. Captain Thane pushed the throttles forward, desperately seeking the speed needed for takeoff, while monitoring every instrument and gauge for signs of trouble. The aircraft began its acceleration down runway 25, the wheels creating spray as they cut through the slush and standing water that had accumulated despite the efforts of the ground crew. The passengers could feel the aircraft struggling, the usual smooth acceleration replaced by an unsettling vibration that seemed to increase rather than decrease as they gained speed. Co-pilot Kenneth Raymond called out airspeed readings, his voice betraying the tension that both pilots were feeling. The aircraft needed to reach a minimum speed of 119 miles per hour to achieve takeoff, but the readings were climbing much more slowly than normal. The accumulation of slush and ice on the runway was creating drag that the engines struggled to overcome, while the additional weight of ice on the aircraft itself required even more speed than usual. Captain Thane kept the throttles at maximum power, hoping that momentum would carry them to the critical speed needed for liftoff. The aircraft lifted briefly off the runway at approximately 117 miles per hour, giving everyone aboard a moment of hope that they had finally overcome the challenging conditions. For a few precious seconds, it seemed that their persistence had paid off, and they would soon be climbing safely above the storm clouds toward home. Frank Swift, still holding his camera ready, must have felt a surge of relief as the aircraft left the ground. But the celebration was premature, as the aircraft immediately began to lose altitude, the insufficient speed and additional ice weight creating a deadly combination that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. The realization that something was terribly wrong came quickly. Instead of the steady climb that should have followed takeoff, the aircraft was sinking back toward the ground with alarming speed. Captain Thane fought desperately with the controls, trying to maintain altitude while calling out emergency procedures to his co-pilot. The passengers could feel the aircraft descending, and the initial relief of takeoff turned to panic as they realized they were in serious trouble. Some passengers began to pray, others gripped their armrests tightly, and a few called out to loved ones, as if their voices could somehow carry across the distance to England. The aircraft struck a house at the end of the runway with tremendous force, the impact tearing off the left wing and sending the fuselage careening across the snow-covered ground like a deadly projectile. The sound of the impact was horrific, metal tearing and engines screaming as the aircraft disintegrated around its occupants. Frank Swift, who had been taking photographs just seconds before impact, was among the first to perish as the camera section of the aircraft bore the brunt of the initial collision. His camera flew from his hands, the final photographs still inside, waiting to be developed and to tell the story of these final moments. The aircraft continued its deadly trajectory, the main fuselage sliding across the icy ground before striking a wooden hut that housed airport equipment and supplies. The structure exploded on impact, sending debris flying in all directions and creating additional hazards for anyone who might have survived the initial crash. But the worst was yet to come, as the out-of-control aircraft finally came to rest against a building that contained a truck loaded with fuel and tires, creating the perfect conditions for a catastrophic fire. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating, a massive fireball that erupted with such violence that it could be seen from miles away. The fuel from both the aircraft and the truck ignited simultaneously, creating an inferno that reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The sound of the explosion echoed across Munich like thunder, a thunderous roar that seemed to go on forever before being replaced by the horrific crackling of flames consuming everything in their path. The heat was so intense that it melted metal and glass, creating a hellish landscape where human survival seemed impossible. Frank Swift, who had been taking photographs just seconds before impact, was among the first to perish in the inferno that consumed the forward section of the aircraft. His body was found still clutching his camera case, the professional instincts that had made him such a respected journalist, evident even in his final moments. The camera itself survived the initial impact, but was damaged by the intense heat of the fire, though the film inside would later yield those haunting final images. 23 people died in the crash, including 8 Manchester United players, 3 club officials, 8 journalists, 2 crew members, and 2 passengers. The loss of life was staggering, representing not just individual tragedies, but the destruction of an entire generation of football talent. Duncan Edwards, the young midfielder who many considered destined for greatness, survived the initial impact, but was critically injured with multiple fractures, internal injuries, and severe kidney damage. He was rushed to Munich's Rechts der Isar hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. For 15 days, Edwards fought against his injuries with the same determination he had shown on the football pitch, occasionally regaining consciousness and asking about his teammates. His family rushed from England to be at his bedside, maintaining a vigil that captured the attention of the entire football world. Edwards's final words, according to those present, were reportedly about his concern for his teammates and his desire to play football again, a poignant reminder of the passion that had driven him throughout his short but brilliant career. The immediate aftermath of the crash was chaos unlike anything the airport personnel or local emergency services had ever experienced. Local residents rushed to the scene despite the obvious dangers, many risking their own lives to pull survivors from the burning wreckage. The heat from the fire was so intense that rescue attempts had to be coordinated carefully to avoid additional casualties. Airport firefighting equipment was quickly overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, and additional resources had to be summoned from across Munich. The scene was one of absolute devastation, with twisted metal, burning debris, and the constant threat of additional explosions from remaining fuel. Matt Busby, the team's manager and the architect of the Busby Babes philosophy, was critically injured with severe chest and leg injuries that weren't expected to be survivable. He was rushed to the same hospital as Duncan Edwards, where he underwent multiple emergency surgeries. Busby spent weeks in critical condition, drifting in and out of consciousness and unaware of the full extent of the tragedy that had befallen his team. When he finally regained full consciousness and learned of the deaths of his players, the psychological impact was almost as devastating as his physical injuries. Doctors worried that the emotional trauma might prove fatal even if his body recovered from the crash. Bobby Charlton, who would later become one of England's greatest players and a symbol of Manchester United's resilience, was thrown clear of the aircraft during the impact and suffered relatively minor physical injuries. However, the psychological scars from witnessing the death of his teammates and friends would remain with him for life. Charlton later described the surreal experience of finding himself alive and relatively unharmed while surrounded by such devastation. The guilt of surviving when so many others perished became a burden he carried throughout his career, motivating him to honor their memory through his performances on the pitch. Harry Gregg, the team's goalkeeper who had joined Manchester United just months earlier, became a hero that day by repeatedly returning to the burning wreckage to rescue survivors, despite the very real danger of further explosions. Gregg had been conscious after the crash and quickly realized the extent of the disaster. Ignoring his own injuries and the warnings of rescue personnel, he crawled back into the wreckage multiple times to pull out Bobby Charlton, Dennis Viollet, and several other survivors. His actions undoubtedly saved lives, and his courage in the face of such horror became legendary within the football community. The news of the Munich air disaster, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves throughout the football world and beyond when it reached England that evening. Manchester United wasn't just a football team to the people of Manchester and England. They were symbols of youth, talent, and the bright future of English football. The Busby Babes had captured the imagination of fans across Europe with their attacking style of play and their remarkable success at such young ages. They represented everything that was exciting about the modern game, combining traditional English football values with continental sophistication and tactical innovation. The initial reports were confused and contradictory, with early news bulletins unable to confirm the full extent of the casualties. Families of the players gathered at Old Trafford and at the club's training ground, desperately seeking information about their loved ones. The club's telephone system was overwhelmed with calls from concerned fans, media outlets, and football officials from around the world. As the full scope of the tragedy became clear, the grief was overwhelming, not just in Manchester, but throughout England and across the football community worldwide. The funerals that followed were unlike anything the football world had ever experienced. Thousands of mourners lined the streets of Manchester and the surrounding areas, many traveling hundreds of miles to pay their respects to players they had never met, but had admired from afar. Old Trafford became a shrine where fans left flowers, scarves, and messages of condolence, creating a sea of red and white that stretched for blocks around the stadium. The church services were attended by football luminaries, government officials, and ordinary fans who felt compelled to honor these young men who had died pursuing their dreams. Frank Swift's camera, recovered from the wreckage several days after the crash, contained what would become some of the most historically significant photographs in football history. The images, carefully developed by investigators and later by newspaper technicians, showed the young players in their final moments of life, unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The photographs captured their expressions of anticipation and excitement for the journey home, making them incredibly poignant documents of lives cut short. Swift himself had been a beloved figure in football, a former England international goalkeeper who had earned 19 caps for his country and had been known for his jovial personality and his dedication to the sport even after his playing career ended. Swift's transition from player to journalist had been seamless, his understanding of the game and his relationships within the football community making him one of the most respected sports writers of his era. His coverage of Manchester United's European campaign had been both professional and passionate, capturing not just the tactical aspects of their matches, but the human drama of young Englishmen competing on the continental stage for the first time. His death represented not just the loss of a talented journalist, but the silencing of a voice that had been instrumental in helping English fans understand and appreciate the European game. The investigation into the crash was extensive and involved aviation experts from multiple countries, as international aviation safety was still a developing field in 1958. The primary cause was identified as the accumulation of slush and ice on the runway, which prevented the aircraft from reaching the necessary takeoff speed despite multiple attempts. The airspeed ambassador required specific conditions to perform optimally, and the weather at Munich that day was far from ideal. The investigation revealed that the aircraft had reached only 117 miles per hour at the point of attempted takeoff, just 2 miles per hour short of the minimum required speed. Additionally, the airport's snow removal equipment had been inadequate for the severe weather conditions that developed throughout the day. Munich's Riem Airport, while modern for its time, lacked the sophisticated weather monitoring and runway maintenance systems that would become standard in later decades. The investigation also examined the decision-making process that led to the attempted takeoff despite the adverse conditions, looking at the various pressures and considerations that influenced Captain Thane's choices. The findings led to significant improvements in aviation safety protocols, including better weather detection systems, improved runway maintenance procedures, and more stringent protocols for takeoff decisions in adverse conditions. The crash also highlighted serious deficiencies in aviation safety protocols of the era that extended beyond just weather considerations. In 1958, weather monitoring technology was primitive compared to modern standards, and pilots often had to make critical decisions based on limited information and personal experience, rather than comprehensive data. The pressure to maintain schedules, especially for charter flights carrying important passengers, sometimes overrode safety considerations in ways that would be unthinkable today. The Munich disaster became a catalyst for fundamental changes in how the aviation industry approached safety, leading to the development of more sophisticated weather detection equipment, better training for pilots in adverse condition decision-making, and clearer protocols for when flights should be delayed or cancelled. The international aviation community recognized that the Munich crash represented a turning point in how safety was prioritized over commercial considerations. The investigation findings were shared globally, leading to improvements in airport infrastructure, aircraft design, and pilot training programs worldwide. The tragedy demonstrated that aviation safety was not just a national concern, but an international responsibility, as aircraft regularly crossed borders and operated in varying conditions that required standardized safety protocols. Manchester United, as an organization, was devastated, but demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. The club's identity had been built around the young players who died at Munich, and rebuilding required not just finding new talent, but completely reimagining what Manchester United would become. Matt Busby, despite his severe injuries and the trauma of losing so many of his players, made the courageous decision to return to manage the team rather than retire, which many expected him to do. His recovery was slow and painful, both physically and emotionally, but his determination to honor the memory of the Busby Babes by continuing their legacy became an inspiration to the entire football community. The rebuilding process took nearly a decade and required Busby to essentially start over with a new philosophy and new players, while maintaining the attacking, entertaining style that had made the original team so beloved. He scoured England and beyond for young talent, always seeking players who embodied not just skill, but the character and passion that had defined the Busby Babes. The emotional weight of replacing irreplaceable players was enormous, and Busby often spoke about the difficulty of working with new players while constantly being reminded of those who had died. The eventual triumph came in 1968, exactly 10 years after the Munich disaster, when Manchester United defeated Benfica 4-1 in the European Cup final at Wembley Stadium. The team that lifted the trophy included Bobby Charlton, who had survived the crash, making the victory especially poignant and meaningful. The match was played on an emotional level that transcended football, with many viewers and participants openly weeping as they thought about the young men who had died pursuing the same dream. Busby's tears after the final whistle were not just of joy, but of remembrance, honoring teammates and players who would never experience such a moment. The families of the victims faced unimaginable grief and loss that extended far beyond the immediate shock of the disaster. Parents who had watched their sons achieve their dreams of playing for Manchester United, who had proudly followed their careers and anticipated decades of success and happiness, suddenly found themselves planning funerals instead of celebrating achievements. The Duncan Edwards family was particularly devastated, as their son had been not just a footballer, but the pride of their community, a young man who had remained humble and connected to his roots despite his growing fame. Wives became widows at tragically young ages, their futures completely altered by events beyond their control. Many of these women had married their husbands when both were barely adults, expecting to grow old together and raise families while supporting football careers that seemed destined to bring glory and financial security. Instead, they found themselves alone, often with young children to support and memories of what might have been. The football community rallied around these families, but no amount of financial support or sympathy could fill the emotional void left by such sudden and complete loss. Children lost their fathers, growing up with photographs and stories instead of the guidance and love that should have shaped their lives. Some of these children were too young to remember their fathers clearly, relying on the memories of others to understand who their dads had been both as footballers and as men. The burden of living up to legacies they could barely remember became a challenge that many of these children carried throughout their lives. The Munich air disaster also had profound effects on European football as a whole, changing how the continental game was perceived and pursued by English clubs. Manchester United's participation in the European Cup had been controversial in England, with the Football League initially opposing their involvement in the continental competition, arguing that domestic obligations should take priority. The tragedy highlighted the risks that teams were taking to pursue European glory, but it also demonstrated the international nature of football and how a disaster in one country could affect people around the world. The crash became a unifying moment for the football community, transcending national boundaries and club rivalries in unprecedented ways. Teams that were normally fierce competitors came together to support Manchester United and honor the memory of the victims. Real Madrid, the dominant force in European football at the time, offered to play a benefit match and made financial contributions to support the families of the victims. The gesture was particularly meaningful because Real Madrid and Manchester United were potential opponents in the European Cup, showing that human compassion could overcome sporting rivalry. Other English clubs, despite their competitive relationships with Manchester United, also offered support in various forms. Some provided players on loan to help United fulfill their remaining fixtures, while others organized testimonial matches to raise funds for the victims' families. The Football League, which had initially opposed European participation, was forced to reconsider its position and eventually embraced continental competition as an essential part of English football's development. One of the most haunting aspects of the disaster was how close it came to being avoided entirely, a reality that tormented survivors and family members for decades afterward. If the weather had cleared just an hour earlier, if the runway conditions had been slightly better, if the decision had been made to postpone the flight until the following day, 23 lives might have been saved. The randomness of tragedy is perhaps what makes it so difficult to comprehend and accept, challenging fundamental beliefs about fairness and control over one's destiny. These were young men at the peak of their physical condition, talented athletes who seemed invincible on the football pitch, Yet they proved as vulnerable as anyone else to the forces of nature and mechanical failure. The contrast between their athletic prowess and their human mortality created a profound cognitive dissonance that affected not just their families and teammates, but the entire sporting community. The realization that talent, youth, and success provided no protection against tragedy forced a re-evaluation of priorities and values throughout the football world. Frank Swift's final photographs, developed after his death, became some of the most important historical documents related to the disaster and serve as a permanent reminder of lives lived fully in their final moments. The images captured not just the faces of the victims, but their expressions of anticipation and excitement for the journey home, their animated conversations about future matches and personal plans, their complete unawareness that these were their final hours of life. The photographs serve as a powerful reminder that tragedy often strikes when people are at their happiest, when they're looking forward to the future and making plans that will never come to fruition. Swift's dedication to his craft, his desire to document this important moment in football history, inadvertently created a permanent record of the final moments of the Busby Babes that has become invaluable to historians and fans seeking to understand the human dimension of the tragedy. The irony that his final act as a journalist was to document the disaster that would claim his own life adds an additional layer of poignancy to his story and to the photographs themselves. If you're watching this and thinking about the dreams you've been postponing, the goals you've been putting off until tomorrow, let this story be a reminder that tomorrow is never guaranteed. These young men had everything to live for, careers that were just beginning to flourish, families they were building, achievements they were working toward. Yet in an instant, all of that potential was extinguished. Don't wait for the perfect moment to tell someone you love them, to pursue that passion you've been thinking about, or to take that trip you've been planning. Life is fragile and unpredictable, and the only moment we truly have is right now. The technical investigation into the crash was exhaustive and led to fundamental changes in aviation safety protocols that continue to influence commercial aviation today. The role of runway contamination in preventing successful takeoffs was studied extensively, leading to improved snow and ice removal procedures at airports worldwide and the development of better methods for measuring and communicating runway conditions to pilots. The investigation also examined the decision-making process that led to the attempted takeoff, despite the adverse conditions, resulting in enhanced training for pilots and airport personnel regarding weather-related safety decisions and the establishment of clearer criteria for when flights should be delayed or canceled. The psychological investigation into pilot decision-making under pressure became a new field of study, recognizing that technical skill alone was insufficient if pilots were not properly trained to handle the various pressures they might face. The Munich investigation revealed that Captain Thine had been influenced by multiple factors beyond just weather conditions, including schedule pressure, passenger expectations, and commercial considerations. These findings led to improved training programs that taught pilots how to resist external pressures and make decisions based solely on safety considerations. The investigation also highlighted the need for better communication between different parties involved in flight operations. The coordination between airport personnel, weather services, and flight crews was found to be inadequate, leading to miscommunications about actual conditions and available options. New protocols were established requiring clearer communication chains and better documentation of decisions and conditions, ensuring that all parties had access to the same information when making critical safety decisions. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound and long-lasting, extending far beyond the physical injuries they sustained. Bobby Charlton, despite going on to have one of the most successful careers in football history, often spoke about the survivor's guilt he experienced and how the crash affected his perspective on life and football. The burden of representing not just himself, but the memory of his deceased teammates added pressure to every match he played and every decision he made throughout his career. Harry Gregg, the goalkeeper who became a hero by rescuing teammates from the wreckage, struggled with the trauma for years afterward, experiencing nightmares and anxiety attacks that interfered with his ability to play football at the highest level. The hero narrative that surrounded his actions, while well-deserved, also created additional pressure as he felt obligated to live up to an idealized version of himself that didn't account for his human vulnerabilities and ongoing trauma. Other survivors faced different challenges, with some never fully recovering from their physical injuries, and others finding that the psychological impact affected their relationships, their careers, and their ability to enjoy life. The crash served as a stark reminder that professional athletes, despite their fame and success, are human beings who experience the same emotions and vulnerabilities as everyone else. The lack of psychological support available in 1958 meant that many survivors had to cope with their trauma largely on their own, without the benefits of modern understanding about post-traumatic stress and trauma recovery. The memorial services and tributes that followed the crash were remarkable in their scope and emotion, demonstrating the profound impact that these young footballers had made not just on their sport, but on society as a whole. The funeral of Duncan Edwards, in particular, drew thousands of mourners who lined the streets of Dudley to pay their respects to the young midfielder who had promised so much. Local schools were closed for the day, businesses shuttered their doors as a mark of respect, and the entire community came together to mourn a son they had watched grow from a schoolboy into an international star. The fact that Edwards had survived the initial crash only to die from his injuries 2 weeks later made his death especially tragic, as it gave false hope to fans and family members who believed he might recover and eventually return to football. The daily updates on his condition had been followed by millions of people around the world, creating a sense of shared investment in his survival that made his eventual death feel like a personal loss for everyone who had hoped and prayed for his recovery. The rebuilding of Manchester United after the disaster became one of the most inspiring stories in football history, demonstrating the power of human resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming tragedy. Matt Busby, despite his own severe injuries and the trauma of losing so many of his players, was determined to create a new team that would honor the memory of those who died while establishing its own identity and achievements. The process was gradual and difficult, requiring not just new players, but a complete reconstruction of the club's culture and philosophy. Busby faced the enormous challenge of replacing irreplaceable players while maintaining the attacking, entertaining style of play that had made the original Busby Babes so beloved by fans around the world. He refused to simply buy established stars, instead continuing his philosophy of developing young talent, believing that this approach would best honor the memory of the players who had died. The emotional weight of working with new young players, while constantly being reminded of those he had lost, was enormous, and Busby often spoke about the difficulty of forming new relationships while grieving for those who could never be replaced. The gradual emergence of a new generation of Manchester United stars, including George Best, Dennis Law, and others who joined Bobby Charlton in creating another legendary team, demonstrated that while individual players could never be replaced, the spirit and philosophy that had made the club special could survive and flourish. The fact that United eventually achieved European success in 1968 was seen not just as a football triumph, but as a vindication of the dreams and aspirations that had died at Munich. The disaster also highlighted the importance of sports journalism and the risks that reporters take to cover the stories that matter to fans around the world. Frank Swift and the 7 other journalists who died in the crash had been doing their jobs, following the team to provide comprehensive coverage for newspapers and radio stations back home. Their deaths were a reminder that sports journalism, like aviation, involved risks that were often taken for granted by both practitioners and consumers of their work. The fact that Swift died while taking photographs, doing exactly what he loved and what he was trained to do, added an extra layer of poignancy to the tragedy, while also highlighting the dedication that characterized the best sports journalists of the era. Swift's commitment to documenting Manchester United's European adventure had put him in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time, but his photographs became invaluable historical documents that preserved the memory of the Busby Babes for future generations. The other journalists who died each had their own stories and contributions to football coverage that were cut short by the disaster. Their collective loss represented not just individual tragedies, but a significant blow to sports journalism in England, removing experienced voices who had helped fans understand and appreciate the evolving nature of football in the modern era. The coverage of Manchester United's subsequent European campaigns always carried an extra emotional weight, as writers tried to honor the memory of their deceased colleagues while continuing to serve their readers. The international response to the disaster was remarkable and demonstrated the global reach of football even in the 1950s, when international communication was far more limited than today. Messages of condolence poured in from clubs, players, and fans around the world, often taking days or weeks to reach Manchester, due to the slower pace of international mail and communication. Red Star Belgrade, the team that Manchester United had just played against, was among the first to express their grief and solidarity, sending representatives to attend the funerals and offering to play benefit matches to raise funds for the victims' families. The disaster transcended club rivalries and national boundaries, uniting the football community in mourning for the lost players and recognition of the fragility of life. Teams from across Europe offered various forms of support, from financial contributions to loan players, to help United fulfill their remaining fixtures. The gesture was particularly meaningful in an era when international football relationships were still developing, and when political tensions between nations could easily spill over into sporting rivalries. The response from ordinary fans was equally remarkable, with letters, flowers, and donations arriving at Old Trafford from people who had never visited Manchester but felt compelled to express their sympathy and support. The shared grief created a sense of global football community that hadn't existed before, establishing precedents for how the football world would respond to future tragedies and demonstrating the power of sport to unite people across cultural and national boundaries. The legacy of the Munich air disaster extends far beyond football into broader discussions about safety, risk management, and the value of human life versus commercial pressures that remain relevant today. The crash occurred during an era when aviation was still relatively new and safety protocols were not as developed as they are today. But the fundamental tensions between safety and commercial considerations continue to influence decision-making in various industries and contexts. The pressure to maintain schedules and the financial implications of delays that influence the decision to attempt takeoff, despite dangerous conditions, reflect ongoing challenges in balancing safety against other considerations. The disaster served as a wake-up call for the aviation industry and led to improvements that have undoubtedly. The legacy of the Munich air disaster extends far beyond football into broader discussions about safety, risk management, and the value of human life versus commercial pressures that remain relevant today. The crash occurred during an era when aviation was still relatively new and safety protocols were not as developed as they are today, but the fundamental tensions between safety and commercial considerations continue to influence decision-making in various industries and contexts. The pressure to maintain schedules and the financial implications of delays that influence the decision to attempt takeoff despite dangerous conditions reflect ongoing challenges in balancing safety against other considerations. The disaster served as a wake-up call for the aviation industry and led to improvements that have undoubtedly saved countless lives in the decades since. But the underlying issues about prioritizing safety over convenience and cost continue to surface in various forms across different industries and situations. The human cost of the Munich disaster was immeasurable, not just in terms of the lives lost, but in the ripple effects that spread through families, communities, and the entire football world for generations. The children who grew up without fathers, the wives who became widows in their 20s, the parents who buried their sons, the teammates who survived with permanent physical and psychological scars, all represent the true price of that February afternoon in Munich. Their stories remind us that behind every statistic and every news report are real people whose lives are forever changed by events beyond their control. The Munich air disaster also fundamentally changed how football clubs approached player safety and travel arrangements. The tragedy highlighted the risks inherent in the increasingly international nature of football competition, leading to more careful consideration of travel arrangements, weather conditions, and safety protocols. Clubs began investing more heavily in travel safety, working with aviation experts to minimize risks and developing contingency plans for dealing with adverse conditions. The psychological support systems that were virtually non-existent in 1958 gradually developed in response to tragedies like Munich, as the football community recognized that athletes were not immune to trauma and required specialized care to deal with the unique pressures they faced. The understanding that physical recovery was only part of the healing process after a traumatic event led to the development of counseling services and support networks that are now standard throughout professional sports. The media coverage of the Munich disaster also established new standards for how tragic events should be reported, balancing the public's right to information with respect for the victims and their families. The initial coverage was often sensationalized and sometimes inaccurate, as reporters struggled to gather information from the scene and communicate it effectively to audiences back home. The lessons learned from this coverage influenced journalism education and professional standards, emphasizing accuracy, sensitivity, and respect for human dignity in reporting on tragedies. Frank Swift's role in the disaster as both victim and inadvertent documentarian created a unique perspective on the event that continues to influence how we understand and remember what happened. His photographs, recovered from the wreckage, provide an intimate glimpse into the final moments of the victims' lives, capturing their humanity and their complete unawareness of what was about to occur. The images serve as powerful reminders that tragedy strikes ordinary people living ordinary moments, transforming routine experiences into historical events of profound significance. The technical aspects of the crash investigation established new protocols for international cooperation in aviation safety research. The Munich disaster involved an English aircraft, German airport facilities, and victims from multiple countries, requiring unprecedented coordination between different national aviation authorities. The investigation process and the sharing of findings established precedents for how future international aviation disasters would be handled, leading to more standardized approaches to safety research and implementation of improvements. The weather conditions that contributed to the crash also highlighted the need for better meteorological services at airports and improved communication between weather services and flight operations. The development of more sophisticated weather monitoring equipment and better training for personnel in interpreting and communicating weather information has since become standard at airports worldwide. The Munich investigation contributed to the understanding of how seemingly minor weather conditions could create catastrophic situations for aircraft operations. The airport infrastructure improvements that followed the Munich disaster were implemented not just at Munich's Riem Airport, but at facilities around the world. Better runway maintenance equipment, improved de-icing procedures, and more effective snow removal systems became standard features at airports in cold weather climates. The disaster demonstrated that airport infrastructure was as critical to flight safety as aircraft maintenance and pilot training. The development of crew resource management and decision-making training for pilots was significantly influenced by the analysis of Captain Thain's decisions leading up to the third takeoff attempt. The investigation revealed that even experienced, competent pilots could make poor decisions when faced with multiple pressures and limited information. This led to new training programs that focused not just on technical flying skills, but on decision-making processes, communication, and the ability to resist external pressures that might compromise safety. The Manchester United tragedy also influenced how professional sports teams approached risk management in all aspects of their operations. The recognition that a single event could devastate an entire organization led to the development of insurance policies, contingency planning, and risk assessment procedures that are now standard throughout professional sports. Teams began spreading their travel arrangements across multiple flights, diversifying their exposure to risk and ensuring that a single incident could not destroy an entire organization. The emotional impact on the broader football community created lasting changes in how the sport dealt with tragedy and supported affected individuals and organizations. The outpouring of support for Manchester United and the families of the victims established precedents for mutual aid and solidarity that continue to influence how the football community responds to crises. The collective response demonstrated that competition on the field did not preclude cooperation and compassion off it. The memory of the Busby Babes became a permanent part of Manchester United's identity, influencing everything from the club's approach to youth development to its commercial relationships and community engagement. The tragedy created a sense of destiny and purpose that motivated subsequent generations of players and managers, establishing a culture of excellence and determination that honored the memory of those who died. The club's commitment to developing young talent rather than simply buying established stars became a direct tribute to Matt Busby's original philosophy and the players who had embodied it. The annual memorial services and commemorative events that followed the disaster established new traditions in football for remembering and honoring those who had died in service to the sport. The February 6th anniversary became a day of reflection, not just for Manchester United but for the entire football community, creating an annual opportunity to remember the victims and reflect on the lessons learned from their deaths. These commemorative traditions influenced how other tragedies in football would be remembered and honored in future years. The Munich disaster also contributed to the development of international football as a truly global phenomenon. The tragedy demonstrated that football had transcended national boundaries to become a shared cultural experience that could unite people across different countries and cultures. The international response to the disaster and the global mourning for the victims showed that football had become more than just a sport, but a universal language that connected people regardless of their backgrounds. The educational impact of the disaster extended beyond aviation safety to influence broader discussions about risk, responsibility, and the value of human life in modern society. The Munich tragedy became a case study in business schools, aviation academies, and journalism programs, teaching future professionals about the importance of ethical decision-making and the consequences of prioritizing commercial considerations over safety and human welfare. The technological improvements in aircraft design and safety systems that followed the Munich investigation contributed to the remarkable safety record that commercial aviation enjoys today. The disaster highlighted specific vulnerabilities in aircraft performance under adverse conditions, leading to improvements in engine design, de-icing systems, and takeoff performance calculations that have prevented countless similar accidents in the decades since. If you've been moved by this story, take a moment to appreciate the people in your life who make it meaningful, because the Busby Babes remind us that talent, youth, and dreams provide no protection against the unpredictability of fate. Share this video with someone who loves football or who needs to be reminded that every day is a gift, because these young men teach us that we must live fully in the present while we have the chance. Subscribe to our channel if you want to continue exploring the stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the lessons we can learn from both triumph and tragedy. The Munich air disaster remains one of the most significant events in sports history, not just because of the number of lives lost, but because of the potential that was extinguished and the ripple effects that continue to influence football and aviation safety to this day. The Busby Babes represented the future of English football, young players who could have gone on to achieve greatness both individually and collectively, and their deaths created a void that could never be filled. Frank Swift's camera captured their final moments of hope and excitement, preserving forever the memory of dreams that were never fulfilled and potential that was never realized, serving as the eternal reminder that life is precious, unpredictable, and deserving of our deepest respect and fullest engagement while we have the privilege to live it.